The rejection email arrived at 6:15 a.m., cold and final as winter fog rolling over Newport Beach Marina. Ryan Mitchell stared at his phone screen, Isabella Cross's corporate signature mocking him, while his 7-year-old daughter Sophie wheezed in the next room. 3 days off. That's all he'd asked for. 3 days to get his little girl to the specialist in Los Angeles. Company policy during peak season? The email read. No exceptions, no humanity. Ryan crushed the phone against his chest, listening to Sophie's labored breathing through paper-thin trailer walls. But sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of justice. Within 48 hours, the woman who'd shown him no mercy would discover she needed something from the man she'd just broken. Something worth $4 million. Something only Ryan's hands could fix. Ryan Mitchell had learned to live quietly in a world built for noise. At 35, his weathered hands told stories his mouth never would. Stories of Navy ships cutting through Pacific storms, of complex electrical systems that kept 1,000-ton vessels alive in hostile waters. Now those same hands fixed pleasure boats for people who earned more in a month than he made in 3 years. The silver bracelet on his wrist caught morning light as he worked, a thin band of metal that never came off, never tarnished, never broke. It was all he had left of Sarah. The trailer park where Ryan and Sophie lived sat like an afterthought behind Newport Beach's glittering facade. While tourists photographed million-dollar yachts and sipped champagne on restaurant patios, Ryan made peanut butter sandwiches on a fold-out table and helped his daughter practice breathing exercises. Sophie's asthma had worsened since they'd moved to California 2 years ago, but Ryan couldn't afford to move inland. The marina job paid just enough to cover rent, groceries, and Sophie's inhaler refills. Everything else was a luxury they couldn't afford, including the specialist visits Sophie desperately needed. Isabella Cross lived in a different universe entirely. Her corner office on the 20th floor of Cross Maritime Holdings overlooked the very marina where Ryan worked, though she'd never once stepped foot on the docks. She inherited the company when her husband Marcus died 3 years earlier, transforming grief into an empire of luxury yacht rentals and charter services. Her black Hermes suits were armor, her steel-gray hair pulled into a perfect chignon that never showed a strand out of place. She ran her business with military precision, viewing employees as expendable resources rather than human beings with families to feed. The morning after Ryan's rejection email, Sophie's breathing grew worse. She sat at their tiny kitchen table, hunched over her rescue inhaler, taking careful, measured breaths that sounded like sandpaper against wood. "Daddy, it hurts!" she whispered, her small voice barely audible over the wheeze. Ryan knelt beside her chair, one hand on her back, feeling each labored breath like a knife to his chest. Dr. Martinez had been clear. Sophie needed to see the pediatric pulmonologist at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. The appointment was already scheduled, already paid for with money Ryan had been saving for months. All he needed was 3 days off work. Isabella's response had been swift and brutal. Not only had she denied his request, but she'd also assigned him extra shifts to cover for a co-worker who'd called in sick. "Peak season means all hands on deck," her assistant had said when Ryan called to explain the situation. "Miss Cross expects 100% commitment from her team." The woman didn't even know his daughter's name. She'd never asked about the little girl who sometimes waited for him after school, sitting on the dock with her homework and a juice box, watching the boats come and go. That evening, as Ryan tucked Sophie into bed in their trailer's single bedroom, she looked up at him with eyes too wise for 7 years old. "Daddy, why don't you find a different job?" she asked, her voice still raspy from the day's breathing struggles. "Maybe someone nicer would let you take me to the doctor." Ryan smoothed her hair back from her forehead, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes we have to stay where we are until we're ready to leave, sweetheart. But I promise you, we'll figure this out." Sophie nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of promises made by parents who had no other choice. Ryan arrived at the marina before dawn the next morning, his tool bag slung over his shoulder and resignation heavy in his chest. He'd made his decision during the sleepless hours before sunrise. He would take Sophie to Los Angeles with or without Isabella Cross's permission. If it cost him his job, so be it. Some things mattered more than steady paychecks, and his daughter's ability to breathe was definitely one of them. The morning fog hung thick over the water, muffling the sound of his footsteps on the wooden dock. The first sign of trouble came when he spotted 3 men in expensive suits standing beside Slip 27, where Isabella's personal yacht was moored. Ocean's Dream was Isabella's crown jewel, a 42-foot azimuth worth exactly $4 million that had never left the marina. Ryan had always found it strange that a woman who owned the most successful yacht rental business on the West Coast kept her personal boat permanently docked. But he'd learned not to ask questions about things that weren't his business. One of the men was gesturing angrily at the yacht's control panel, while another spoke rapidly into his phone. The third man, wearing a badge that identified him as a certified marine electrician, stood with his hands on his hips, shaking his head in defeat. "I've been working on boats for 25 years," Ryan heard him say as he approached. "I've never seen anything like this. The entire electrical system is fried, but not in any pattern that makes sense. It's like someone designed it to fail." Ryan set his tool bag down quietly and listened. The yacht was scheduled to take Isabella and a group of potential Japanese investors to Catalina Island that afternoon, a crucial meeting that could secure financing for Cross Maritime's expansion into the Pacific market. Without the boat functioning, the meeting would have to be cancelled, potentially costing Isabella millions in lost opportunities. The marine electrician had already called in 2 colleagues, both of whom had examined the problem and declared it unsolvable without completely rewiring the entire vessel. "How long would a full rewiring take?" one of the suited men asked. The electrician grimaced. 3 weeks minimum, maybe a month if we run into complications. Bah. The man's face went pale. "The investors fly back to Tokyo tomorrow night. This was our only window." Ryan watched the conversation unfold with growing understanding. Isabella Cross, the woman who had shown him no mercy, was about to learn what it felt like when the universe showed her none in return. Ryan approached the group slowly, his tool bag in hand. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I couldn't help but overhear. Mind if I take a look?" The marine electrician turned to him with barely concealed irritation. "And you are?" "Ryan Mitchell. I maintain the boats here." The man looked him up and down, taking in Ryan's faded flannel shirt and worn work boots. "No offense, buddy, but this isn't a simple maintenance issue. We're dealing with advanced marine electronics here." But something about the problem had caught Ryan's attention. During his 8 years in the Navy, he'd specialized in electrical systems for destroyers and aircraft carriers, systems far more complex than anything found on civilian vessels. He'd also worked on experimental navigation equipment that used similar wiring patterns to what he was seeing on Isabella's yacht. "Mind if I ask what specific symptoms you're getting?" he said to the electrician. The man sighed and consulted his notes. "Power fluctuations across all circuits, navigation systems randomly rebooting, engine control modules going offline intermittently. It's like the boat's having electrical seizures." Ryan nodded thoughtfully. He'd seen similar problems before, during his Navy days, when saltwater corrosion created feedback loops in high-end electronic systems. The fix wasn't complicated if you knew what to look for, but it required understanding how military-grade components integrated with civilian electronics. "Would you mind if I climbed down there and took a quick look?" Ryan asked. "I won't touch anything, just want to see the wiring layout." The electrician shrugged. "Knock yourself out. But I'm telling you, This is beyond repair without a complete overhaul. Ryan lowered himself into the engine compartment, his practiced eye immediately identifying the problem. Someone had installed military surplus navigation equipment without properly isolating it from the yacht's standard electrical system. The result was exactly the kind of cascade failure he'd dealt with dozens of times in the service. 20 minutes later, Ryan emerged from the engine compartment with oil on his shirt and the solution clear in his mind. "I can fix this," he told the astonished electrician, "but it's going to take most of the day, and I'll need some specific parts." The suited men exchanged glances. "You're sure?" one of them asked. Ryan nodded. "Dead sure. Whoever installed your navigation system didn't account for voltage differences between military and civilian components. I can isolate the circuits and install proper buffers, but like I said, it's going to take time." Word traveled fast in the mariner's tight-knit community. Within an hour, news of the yacht's electrical problems and the unknown maintenance worker who claimed he could fix them had reached Isabella Cross in her 20th floor office. She stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the marina where her $4 million investment sat dead in the water, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete loss of control. Isabella's assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Ma'am, there's been a development with Ocean's Dream." Isabella didn't turn from the window. "Let me guess, another expert who thinks he can perform miracles?" "Actually, it's one of our maintenance staff, Ryan Mitchell. He says he can have the boat running by this afternoon." For the first time in 3 years, Isabella Cross felt her perfectly composed mask slip. The name hit her like a physical blow, though she couldn't immediately place why it sounded so familiar. "Ryan Mitchell," she repeated slowly. "The man who submitted the vacation request yesterday?" Her assistant consulted her tablet. "Yes, ma'am. The single father with the sick daughter. The one you denied." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of cosmic irony settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The man she'd refused to help when his child was struggling to breathe was now the only person who could save her company's future. Isabella made her way down to the marina for the first time in 3 years, her heels clicking authoritatively on the wooden dock. She found Ryan Mitchell exactly where her assistant had said he'd be, waist-deep in Ocean's Dream's engine compartment, his tool bag spread out beside him like a surgeon's instruments. His concentration was absolute, his movements precise and confident. This wasn't the desperate maintenance worker she'd imagined when she'd denied his request. This was a craftsman who understood his tools and trusted his knowledge. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying across the water. Ryan looked up, and for a moment Isabella saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of quiet assessment, as if he were taking her measure and finding her wanting. "Miss Cross," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I heard you were having some electrical problems." The understatement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to address directly. "I'm told you believe you can repair my yacht," Isabella said, stepping closer to the boat's edge. "I'm curious about your qualifications for such complex work." Ryan wiped his hands on a shop rag, considering his response. 8 years Navy electrical systems, specializing in advanced navigation and communication equipment. I've worked on everything from patrol boats to aircraft carriers. He paused, letting the information sink in. "The components on your boat aren't nearly as complicated as what I used to maintain." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning fog. "And yet you work as a maintenance technician at my marina." It wasn't a question, but Ryan answered anyway. "Sometimes life takes you places you didn't plan to go." He gestured toward the electrical panel he'd been working on. "Your navigation system was installed by someone who understood the hardware, but didn't account for integration issues. Military components don't play nice with civilian electronics unless you know how to make them compatible. The conversation was interrupted by Isabella's assistant, who approached with obvious urgency. "Ma'am, the Japanese investors just confirmed their departure time. If we can't get the boat running by 2 o'clock, we'll need to cancel the entire meeting." Isabella's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "How long do you need, Mr. Mitchell?" Ryan consulted his watch. 6 hours, maybe 7. But I'll need some specialized parts, and they're not cheap. Isabella nodded curtly. "Whatever you need, my assistant will handle the procurement." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Mr. Mitchell, I assume you'll want to discuss compensation for this work." Ryan looked up from his tools, and Isabella saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Not greed or satisfaction, but a kind of weary disappointment. "We can talk about that when the job's done," he said quietly. "Right now, I've got work to do." As Isabella walked back toward her office building, she found herself thinking about the man she'd just left working on her boat. Ryan Mitchell wasn't what she'd expected. His competence was obvious, his professionalism unquestionable, but there was something else. A quiet dignity that made her previous dismissal of his vacation request seem not just callous but actively cruel. She'd built her business on the principle that emotions were liabilities. But standing on that dock, she'd felt something she'd thought she'd buried with her husband. Shame. Ryan worked through the morning with steady focus, his hands moving through familiar routines that took him back to hot engine rooms on Navy destroyers. The silver bracelet on his wrist caught the light as he worked, a constant reminder of the woman who'd believed he could fix anything that was broken. Sarah had been a doctor, someone who understood the weight of other people's lives in your hands. She'd have known what to do about Isabella Cross, about the impossible position he now found himself in. By noon, Ryan had identified all the problematic connections and begun the delicate process of isolating the military navigation equipment from the yacht's primary electrical system. The work required patience and precision. One wrong move could fry thousands of dollars in electronic components, or worse, create a fire hazard that could sink the boat. But his hands were steady, his knowledge sure, and gradually the yacht's systems began responding normally to diagnostic tests. A small crowd had gathered on the dock to watch him work. Word had spread through the marina community that one of their own was attempting something 3 certified experts had declared impossible. Jimmy Rodriguez, who managed the fuel dock, brought Ryan a sandwich and a bottle of water. "Heard you're giving the Ice Queen some trouble," he said with a grin. Ryan shook his head. "Just doing my job, Jimmy. Nothing more than that." But it was more than that, and Ryan knew it. Every connection he made, every circuit he tested, was a small act of defiance against the woman who'd valued her company's profits over his daughter's health. He could have walked away, could have let Isabella's yacht stay broken and her crucial meeting fail. Instead, he was using skills she'd never known he possessed to save her business. The irony wasn't lost on him, but it brought no satisfaction. Only the grim determination to prove his own worth to himself, if not to her. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Ryan started the yacht's engines for the first time in 48 hours. The sound was sweet and clean, without the irregular stuttering that had plagued the electrical system. Navigation screens flickered to life, showing clear GPS readings and accurate depth soundings. The boat's various electronic systems synchronized perfectly, talking to each other in the digital language Ryan had taught them to speak. He'd done it, pulled off what 3 experts had called impossible. Isabella arrived at the dock just as Ryan was closing the engine compartment and packing his tools. She'd changed from her morning's business suit into more appropriate attire for a boat trip: navy blue slacks, and a white blazer that managed to look both practical and expensive. Her hair was still perfectly arranged, but Ryan noticed something different about her posture, a slight relaxation in the rigid control she usually maintained. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, stepping aboard Ocean's Dream with surprising grace. "I understand congratulations are in order." Ryan secured his tool bag and stood, wiping his hands on the shop rag he'd been carrying all day. "Your boat's ready, Miss Cross. All systems are functional and properly integrated. You shouldn't have any more electrical problems." He paused, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "Your investors won't be disappointed." Isabella nodded, then did something that surprised both of them. She extended her hand for a handshake. "I owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Mitchell. This meeting is crucial for our company's expansion plans." Ryan looked at her outstretched hand for a moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, businesslike, but her skin was softer than he'd expected. "Just doing my job," he said, echoing his earlier words to Jimmy. "About your compensation," Isabella began, but Ryan interrupted her with a slight shake of his head. "We can discuss that later. Right now you've got investors to impress." He shouldered his tool bag and stepped off the yacht, then turned back one more time. "Miss Cross, I hope your meeting goes well." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no hidden agenda. Just a simple statement that somehow carried more weight than any accusation could have. Isabella watched him walk away, her hand still tingling slightly from their handshake. Something had shifted in the dynamic between them, though she couldn't quite identify what. The man who'd just saved her company's future was the same man whose family emergency she'd dismissed without a second thought. The same man who was probably going home to a sick child who needed medical care he couldn't afford to provide. The realization settled in her stomach like a cold stone. The meeting with the Japanese investors went flawlessly. Ocean's Dream performed like the precision instrument she'd paid $4 million for, cutting through Pacific swells with elegant efficiency, while her guests sipped sake and discussed expansion opportunities. Isabella played the perfect host, charming and knowledgeable, but her mind kept drifting to Ryan Mitchell's weathered hands and the silver bracelet that had caught the light as he worked. That evening, as Isabella stood in her empty penthouse apartment overlooking Newport Harbor, she found herself thinking about the conversation she'd avoided having with Ryan about his compensation. He'd fixed her yacht, saved her company's future, really, and she hadn't even bothered to discuss payment. The oversight felt like more than simple forgetfulness. It felt like another small cruelty in a series of small cruelties she'd inflicted without conscious thought. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found her assistant's number. "Janet, I need you to pull Ryan Mitchell's personnel file. I want to know everything about his background, his qualifications, his family situation." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, it's almost 11 p.m. Isabella looked out at the lights reflecting on the dark water. "I know what time it is. Please have the file on my desk first thing tomorrow morning." The personnel file made for sobering reading. Ryan Mitchell, 35 years old, Navy veteran with exemplary service record, widowed 2 years ago when his wife died of lung cancer. One dependent, Sophie Mitchell, age 7, diagnosed with severe asthma requiring ongoing specialist care. Current salary barely above minimum wage despite qualifications that should have earned him 3 times as much. Isabella stared at the medical insurance information, noting the high deductible and limited specialist coverage that explained why Ryan had been so desperate for those 3 days off. She'd spent 3 years building walls around herself, creating systems and policies designed to keep emotional complications at bay. Employee problems were human resources issues to be managed, not personal dramas requiring her attention. but Ryan Mitchell had forced himself into her awareness in a way she couldn't ignore. He'd proven himself indispensable while simultaneously highlighting her own callousness. The combination was deeply unsettling. Isabella made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of calling Ryan to her office, she drove to the marina early the next morning and sought him out on the docks. She found him working on a routine maintenance issue with one of the charter boats, his movements economical and sure. He looked up when her shadow fell across his work area, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Cross," he said, not quite a greeting, but not unfriendly either. "Is there a problem with Ocean's Dream?" Isabella shook her head. "The yacht is fine. I wanted to discuss your compensation for yesterday's work." Ryan set down his wrench and gave her his full attention. "Okay." The single word hung in the air between them, neither invitation nor dismissal. "Your repair work saved a deal worth approximately $15 million to my company," Isabella said, the words sounding strange in her own ears. She wasn't accustomed to explaining her business decisions to employees, but something about Ryan's quiet competence demanded honesty. "I think a standard repair fee would be insulting under the circumstances." Ryan wiped his hands on his work rag, a gesture Isabella was beginning to recognize as his way of buying time to think. "What did you have in mind?" he asked finally. Isabella had prepared for this conversation, but standing here on the dock with the morning sun reflecting off the water, her rehearsed speech felt inadequate. "I've been thinking about your background," she said instead. "Navy electrical systems specialist, 8 years of experience with complex marine electronics. You're overqualified for maintenance work." Ryan's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Sometimes being overqualified is safer than being unemployed," he said quietly. The words hit Isabella harder than she'd expected. "Mr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology." Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the admission. "Yesterday morning, you asked for time off to take your daughter to a medical specialist. I denied that request without considering the circumstances. That was wrong of me." Ryan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently turning the silver bracelet on his wrist. "Sophie's appointment is this Friday," he said finally. "Dr. Martinez says her asthma is getting worse, and she needs to see a pediatric pulmonologist in Los Angeles. I've already rescheduled the appointment twice because I couldn't get the time off." Isabella felt something crack inside her chest, a small fissure in the carefully constructed armor she'd worn for 3 years. "Take the time you need," she said. "Take the whole week if necessary. Full pay." Ryan looked at her suspiciously, as if waiting for the catch. "Why?" he asked. The question hung in the salt air between them, carrying weight that surprised them both. Isabella could have given him a dozen business-appropriate answers about recognizing valuable employees or maintaining company morale. Instead, she found herself speaking a truth she hadn't acknowledged even to herself. "Because I remembered what it feels like to be afraid for someone you love," she said quietly. The words created a moment of connection that neither had expected. Ryan's expression softened slightly, and Isabella saw past his careful neutrality to the exhausted father underneath. "Thank you," he said simply. "Sophie will be excited. She's never been to Los Angeles." Isabella nodded, then did something that surprised both of them. "Mr. Mitchell, when you return from Los Angeles, I'd like to discuss a position change. Your skills are being wasted in maintenance." Ryan studied her face, as if trying to determine whether the offer was genuine. "What kind of position?" "Marine electronics specialist. 60,000 base salary plus commission on complex repairs. Your own workshop, your own schedule within reason." Isabella paused, meeting his eyes directly. and comprehensive medical coverage for you and your daughter. Ryan was quiet for so long that Isabella began to worry she'd overstepped somehow. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was trying to keep under control. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Yesterday you wouldn't give me 3 days off. Today you're offering me a career change." Isabella looked out over the marina, watching morning light dance on the water. "Yesterday I was running a business. Today I'm trying to do the right thing." She turned back to Ryan, noting the way the silver bracelet caught the light as his hands moved. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us who we really are, or who we want to be." The conversation was interrupted by a small voice calling across the marina. "Daddy!" Sophie Mitchell came running down the dock, her backpack bouncing as she hurried toward them. She stopped short when she saw Isabella, suddenly shy in the presence of the woman her father worked for. "Sorry, Daddy, I didn't know you were busy." Ryan knelt down to Sophie's level, his entire demeanor transforming as he focused on his daughter. "It's okay, sweetheart. Miss Cross and I were just talking about work." He smoothed Sophie's hair back from her forehead with gentle fingers. "How was school?" "Good," Sophie said, but Isabella noticed the slight wheeze in her voice, the way she took careful, measured breaths. "Mrs. Patterson said we're going to study ocean animals next week. Can you tell me about the fish that live around the boats?" Isabella found herself watching the interaction with unexpected fascination. The transformation in Ryan when he talked to his daughter was remarkable. The careful neutrality disappeared, replaced by warmth and patience that made him seem like an entirely different person. This was the man who'd moved across the country to give his sick child a better life, who'd taken a job far below his qualifications to stay close to her. "Sophie," Ryan said gently, "I want you to meet Miss Cross. She owns the marina where I work." Sophie looked up at Isabella with curious eyes that held none of the wariness her father carried. "Hi," she said with 7-year-old directness. "Are you the one who makes my daddy work so much?" "Hmm?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, though Sophie had asked it with innocent curiosity rather than malice. Isabella knelt down to bring herself to the child's eye level, suddenly aware that her answer mattered more than she'd expected. "I am," Isabella said honestly. "But your daddy is very good at his job, and that makes him important to have around." She paused, studying Sophie's face. "I heard you're going to see a doctor in Los Angeles soon." Sophie's expression grew serious. "Yeah, Dr. Martinez says the Los Angeles doctor might be able to help me breathe better." She looked up at her father with complete trust. "Daddy says we're going to make it an adventure. Maybe see the ocean from up high." Isabella felt that crack in her chest widen a little more. "That sounds wonderful," she said, meaning it. "I hope the doctor has good news for you." She stood and turned back to Ryan, who was watching the interaction with careful attention. "Mr. Mitchell, take your time in Los Angeles. Do whatever you need to do for Sophie." As Isabella walked back toward her office, she could hear Sophie chattering excitedly to her father about the upcoming trip. The sound followed her across the marina, a reminder of what really mattered in life. She'd spent 3 years focused on profit margins and growth projections, building a successful business while losing sight of the human cost of her decisions. That afternoon, Isabella called her assistant with specific instructions. "Janet, I want you to research the best pediatric pulmonologists in Southern California. Not just in Los Angeles. I want options in San Diego, San Francisco, anywhere within driving distance." Her assistant's confusion was audible through the phone. "Ma'am, is this for a client?" "It's for an employee's daughter," Isabella said. "I want to know which doctors have the best success rates with severe asthma cases, which hospitals have the most advanced treatment options. Money isn't a factor." She paused, realizing how unusual the request must sound. And Janet. I want this information by tomorrow morning. 3 days later, Isabella found herself doing something she hadn't done in months, leaving her office in the middle of the day to walk through the marina. She told herself she was just checking on operations, but she knew she was really looking for Ryan and Sophie. She found them at the end of Dock C, where Sophie was sitting cross-legged with her homework, while Ryan worked on a routine engine service. "Miss Cross," Sophie called out when she spotted Isabella approaching. "Daddy says we're leaving for Los Angeles tomorrow morning. I packed my bag already." The excitement in the child's voice was infectious, and Isabella found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks. "That's wonderful, Sophie," Isabella said, settling onto the dock beside the little girl. "Are you excited about the trip?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, then leaned closer, as if sharing a secret. "Daddy booked us a hotel room with a view of the ocean. He says we might even see dolphins." Isabella glanced up at Ryan, who was watching the interaction with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That sounds like a perfect adventure," she told Sophie. "You'll have to tell me all about it when you get back." The promise surprised her. She'd never shown interest in an employee's personal life before, but something about Sophie's enthusiasm made the future conversation seem important. That evening, Isabella made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. She drove to the address listed in Ryan's personnel file, a trailer park tucked behind the expensive restaurants and boutique shops that catered to Newport Beach's wealthy tourists. The contrast was jarring. $1-million yachts visible in the distance, while families struggled to make ends meet in aging mobile homes. Ryan answered her knock with obvious surprise. "Miss Cross, is everything all right?" Isabella held up a manila envelope, suddenly feeling awkward about her unannounced visit. "I brought some information that might be helpful for Sophie's appointment tomorrow." Ryan stepped aside to let her enter the small trailer, and Isabella was struck by how clean and organized everything was, despite the limited space. "Daddy, who's at the door?" Sophie's voice came from the back of the trailer. "It's Miss Cross from the marina," Ryan called back. "She brought something for us." Sophie appeared a moment later in pajamas decorated with sea turtles, her hair still damp from a bath. "Hi, Miss Cross. Do you want to see my suitcase? I packed extra inhalers and my lucky stuffed whale." Isabella found herself genuinely charmed by the child's enthusiasm. "I'd love to see your suitcase," she said, following Sophie to the small bedroom, where a carefully packed bag sat open on the bed. Every item had been chosen with care. Comfortable clothes, favorite books, the mentioned stuffed whale that looked well loved and frequently hugged. "What's in the envelope?" Ryan asked when they returned to the tiny living area. Isabella handed it over, suddenly nervous about his reaction. "Information about pediatric pulmonologists in Southern California. Not just the doctor you're seeing tomorrow, but specialists in San Diego, San Francisco, even some experimental programs at research hospitals." Ryan opened the envelope and scanned the detailed reports inside. His expression grew increasingly amazed as he realized the scope of the information. "Miss Cross, this must have taken hours to compile." Isabella shrugged, trying to minimize the gesture. "I had my assistant research it. I thought it might be helpful to know your options." But Ryan could see through the casual dismissal. This wasn't something she'd delegated to staff. The handwritten notes in the margins, the careful highlighting of relevant information, the personal touches that showed real attention to detail. Isabella Cross had spent her own time researching treatment options for his daughter, a level of personal involvement that seemed completely out of character for the cold businesswoman he thought he knew. "Why?" he asked, the same question he'd posed on the marina dock days earlier. But this time, In the intimate space of his tiny home with his daughter listening nearby, the question carried different weight. Isabella looked around the trailer, taking in the careful attempts to make the small space feel like home. Family photos on the walls, Sophie's artwork stuck to the refrigerator, a few carefully tended plants on the windowsill. Because Sophie deserves the best possible care, Isabella said simply. And because you're a good father who shouldn't have to navigate the medical system alone. She paused, glancing at Sophie, who was listening intently. And because I realized that running a business isn't the same thing as being a good person. The admission hung in the air between them, more honest than anything Isabella had said in years. Ryan looked at the research in his hands, then back at the woman who'd brought it to him. I don't know how to thank you for this, he said quietly. Isabella shook her head. Don't thank me yet. Wait and see if any of it helps Sophie feel better. As Isabella prepared to leave, Sophie surprised everyone by running over and hugging her legs. Thank you for helping my daddy take care of me, the little girl said with simple sincerity. Isabella looked down at the small arms wrapped around her legs and felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the fierce protective instinct that came with caring about someone else's well-being. Take care of yourself in Los Angeles, Sophie, Isabella said, gently patting the child's back. And remember what your daddy always tells you about adventures. Sophie looked up with curious eyes. What's that? Isabella smiled, realizing she was making up wisdom on the spot. That the best adventures are the ones that help us grow stronger. Ryan walked Isabella to her car, both of them aware that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Miss Cross, he began, but she interrupted him. Isabella, she said, I think we're past formal titles. Ryan nodded slowly. Isabella, thank you for this, for all of it. I know this goes way beyond anything you owe an employee. Isabella looked back at the trailer where Sophie's face was pressed against the window, waving goodbye. Maybe that's the point, she said. Maybe some things matter more than employee policies and business procedures. She got into her car, then rolled down the window. Have a safe trip, Ryan, and remember, whatever Sophie needs, we'll figure it out. The trip to Los Angeles changed everything. The pediatric pulmonologist Dr. Sarah Chen reviewed Sophie's case with the thoroughness that comes from genuine expertise, running tests that the local doctors hadn't considered and identifying treatment options that could dramatically improve Sophie's quality of life. But the treatments were expensive, requiring specialist medications and regular monitoring that Ryan's insurance wouldn't fully cover. When Ryan and Sophie returned to Newport Beach 3 days later, they found Isabella waiting for them at the marina with news that made Ryan question everything he thought he knew about his employer. She'd spent the time researching medical insurance supplements and had arranged for Cross Maritime to provide enhanced coverage for all employees with dependents who had chronic medical conditions. It's not charity, Isabella insisted when Ryan tried to thank her. It's good business. Healthy employees are more productive employees. But Ryan could see through the business justification to the personal concern underneath. Isabella Cross was learning to care about people again, and his daughter had somehow become the catalyst for that transformation. Over the following weeks, as Sophie began her new treatment regimen and her breathing improved noticeably, Isabella found herself stopping by the marina more frequently. She told herself she was just checking on operations, but the truth was more complicated. She was drawn to the quiet contentment she felt watching Ryan work, observing the easy affection between father and daughter, witnessing a kind of family happiness she'd forgotten existed. One evening, as the summer sun set over Newport Harbor, Isabella found herself sitting on the dock beside Sophie, while Ryan finished his work for the day. The little girl was reading aloud from a book about marine biology, her voice clear and strong, without the wheeze that had marked every conversation just months before. "Miss Isabella?" Sophie said, using the nickname she'd invented for her father's employer. "Do you have any kids?" The question caught Isabella off guard, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with memories of the life she'd lost. "No," she said quietly. "I don't have children." Sophie considered this with 7-year-old seriousness. "That's sad," she said, matter-of-factly. "You'd be a good mom. You take care of people even when they don't ask you to." The simple observation hit Isabella harder than she'd expected. She looked at this child who'd somehow seen past her carefully constructed defenses to the person she was trying to become. "Sophie," Isabella said carefully, "can I tell you something?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "I used to be married to someone who would have loved meeting you. He would have thought you were very brave for how well you handle your asthma treatments." Sophie's eyes widened with interest. "What happened to him?" Isabella took a breath, realizing she was about to share something she'd never spoken aloud. "He died in an accident 3 years ago. I was very sad for a long time, and I forgot how to care about people the way I should." Sophie reached over and patted Isabella's hand with unconscious compassion. "But you remember now," the child said with confident certainty, "because you helped me and Daddy." That night, Isabella stood in her empty penthouse apartment and made a decision that would have terrified her just months earlier. She was going to stop hiding behind business policies and corporate distance. She was going to let Ryan Mitchell and his daughter matter to her, regardless of the professional complications that might arise. The next morning, Isabella arrived at the marina with a proposal that surprised everyone, including herself. She wanted to promote Ryan to head of marine operations, a position that would put him in charge of all technical aspects of the business, while giving him the flexibility to be present for Sophie's medical appointments and school events. "The position comes with a significant salary increase," she told Ryan as they stood beside Ocean's Dream, the yacht that had brought them together in the most unexpected way. "And I'd like Sophie to know that her college education is covered, whatever school she chooses." Ryan stared at her in amazement. "Isabella, that's incredibly generous, but I can't let you—" "You're not letting me do anything," Isabella interrupted. "I'm making a business decision based on your value to this company." She paused, then added more softly, "And I'm making a personal choice based on how much I've come to care about both of you." The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning the distance they'd maintained for months. Ryan looked at the woman who'd transformed from his cold, distant employer into someone who'd moved heaven and earth to help his daughter, and he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, the possibility of letting someone else matter to him again. "There's something I need to tell you," Ryan said, his fingers automatically finding the silver bracelet on his wrist. "This bracelet belonged to my wife. I've worn it every day since she died because I was afraid that taking it off would mean letting go of her." He looked up at Isabella, who was listening with complete attention. "But watching you with Sophie, seeing how much you care about her, I realized that loving new people doesn't diminish the love we have for the ones we've lost." Isabella felt tears threatening for the first time in years. "Ryan," she began, but he continued before she could finish. Sarah would have liked you," he said simply. "She would have appreciated how you've taken care of Sophie, and she would have told me that life is too short to waste chances at happiness." The conversation was interrupted by Sophie's voice calling across the marina. "Daddy! Miss Isabella! Look what I found!" She was running toward them with something clutched in her small hands, her face bright with excitement. When she reached them, She opened her palms to reveal a perfect sand dollar, white and intact. "It was just sitting on the dock," Sophie said breathlessly. "Mrs. Patterson says sand dollars are good luck, but only if you find them whole." She looked between her father and Isabella with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possess. "I think it means our family is going to be okay." Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in 3 years. "Our family?" she repeated softly, and Sophie nodded with absolute certainty. "You take care of us, and we take care of you. That's what families do." 6 months later, as Isabella stood in the small chapel overlooking Newport Harbor, where she and Ryan were exchanging vows, she thought about the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. Sophie stood beside her as maid of honor, healthy and happy in a yellow dress that brought out the gold flecks in her eyes. The ceremony was simple, attended by Marina friends and Sophie's teacher and Dr. Chen, who'd flown up from Los Angeles to witness the wedding of the little patient who'd changed so many lives. Ryan wore his navy dress uniform, and Isabella had chosen a simple white dress that Sophie had helped her pick out. But the most meaningful moment came when Ryan slipped a new ring onto Isabella's finger, not beside his late wife's wedding band, but on a chain around his neck where it rested close to his heart, a symbol of love that endured beyond death. Isabella understood the gesture's significance, just as she understood that their love hadn't replaced what came before, but had grown alongside it. As they walked down the aisle as a new family, Sophie between them holding both their hands, Isabella thought about the chain of events that had brought them together. A rejected vacation request that had seemed like the end of the world had instead been the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes the universe's sense of justice wasn't twisted after all. Sometimes it was simply waiting for the right moment to reveal its plan. The reception was held on Ocean's Dream, the yacht that had started it all. As the sun set over Newport Harbor and their friends and family celebrated around them, Isabella and Ryan stood at the bow with Sophie between them, watching dolphins play in the boat's wake. "Did you ever think," Sophie said, her voice clear and strong in the salt air, "that Daddy fixing your boat would fix our whole family?" Isabella and Ryan exchanged a look over their daughter's head, both thinking the same thing, that some repairs go deeper than electrical systems, and some healing takes longer than anyone expects. "No," Isabella said, pulling Sophie closer. "I don't think any of us saw this coming." She looked at Ryan. This man who'd taught her that strength sometimes looked like vulnerability, that love could grow in the most unexpected places. "But I'm very glad we found each other." As Ocean's Dream cut through the Pacific swells towards the horizon, carrying its precious cargo of new beginnings and second chances, the silver bracelet on Ryan's wrist caught the last rays of sunlight. It would always be there, a reminder of the love that had made their current happiness possible. Some things were worth keeping forever, not as barriers to new love, but as foundations for the family they were building together. One breath, one heartbeat, one moment of grace at a time.